It started as any other hike. A long, tough route through the mountains, the kind that tested you physically and mentally, but that's what I was after. I liked pushing my limits, feeling my legs burn on steep inclines, and breathing in the crisp, untouched air of the backcountry. It made me feel alive, free, and capable. But no amount of experience prepares you for the moment things go wrong. I was deep in the mountains when I found him, the injured hiker, alone. I'd been on the trail for a while, pacing myself through the terrain, adjusting to the weight of my pack, keeping my breathing steady. I don't remember exactly what I was thinking before I saw him. Probably just focusing on the next ridge, planning my route, gauging how many hours I had before I needed to set up camp. But then I saw movement up ahead, an unusual shape on the trail. He was slumped against a rock, one leg stretched out in front of him at an odd angle, his face pale and drawn. Sweat glistened on his forehead, even though the air was cool. I knew instantly he was in trouble. I stopped a few feet away, scanning him over. His ankle was swollen badly, his boot unlaced, but I could tell it wasn't just a rolled ankle. It was worse. The kind of injury that wasn't going to let him walk out of here on his own. This was before I carried a beacon, before easy access to help. There was no calling for a rescue. No out. I had two choices. Leave him and hope another hiker came along, or get him out myself. Leaving wasn't an option. I took a deep breath, adjusted my pack, and prepared for what I already knew was going to be the hardest miles I had ever walked. The first few hours weren't too bad. I helped him up, let him lean on me, and we started slow, one step at a time. He was gritting his teeth against the pain, trying to keep weight off his ankle, but we were moving. The problem was the terrain. This wasn't an easy, flat trail. This was the mountains, steep ascents, technical descents, and uneven ground that made every step feel uncertain. After an hour, we weren't even close to covering the distance I had hoped for. My pack felt heavier, my shoulders ached from keeping him upright, and I was already sweating more than I should have been. I started breaking it into sections. Get to that tree. Get past that ridge. Just to the next clearing. Every time we stopped, I felt the weight of the situation press down harder. I had food, but not enough for an extended trip. My water supply was okay, but if this took too long, we'd have to start rationing. The daylight was slipping away, and the temperature was going to drop fast once the sun went down. I needed to move faster, but he wasn't able to. That's when I made the choice to start ferrying the gear. I found a relatively flat area and told him to sit tight. I took both of our packs, his on my front, mine on my back, and started hauling them up the trail. I'd go ahead 100 meters, drop them, then come back and help him hobble forward. Then I'd do it again, over and over. I don't know how long I did this, but by the time I set up a camp for the night, I could barely think straight. I got him settled, wrapped his ankle as best I could, and forced myself to eat even though I had no appetite. My arms and legs were shaking from the effort. When I finally lay down, I don't even think I closed my eyes before I was out cold. The next morning was worse. My muscles were stiff, my shoulders raw from where the straps had rubbed against them. I was moving slow, but I had no choice but to keep going. I fell into a rhythm. Carry the packs. Go back. Help him forward. It felt endless. My back was screaming in protest, my legs weak from exhaustion. Every step was harder than the last, and I started to wonder if we were even making progress. My body wasn't responding the way I wanted it to anymore. Then something new. Fatigue started messing with my head. I'd blink and feel like I was somewhere else. My legs moved, but I didn't remember deciding to take a step. At one point, I thought I heard voices on the wind. Other hikers, maybe a rescue team? I turned my head too fast, lost my balance, and nearly went down. There was nothing, just the empty, endless trail ahead. I was running on empty, but I couldn't stop. The second night, I barely got the tent up. I spilled half of my food trying to cook, my hands shaking too much to grip properly. I remember sitting there, staring at nothing, feeling my body shutting down. I wasn't scared exactly, but I knew I was close to a breaking point. If I collapsed, we were both done for. So I forced food down, forced water down, willed my body to keep going. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, packed up everything, and started again. The final day was the hardest. I was past exhaustion. The pain in my shoulders and legs had become something distant, like my body had given up sending signals to my brain. I just moved on autopilot. Step, lift, carry, drop, go back, repeat. And then, at some point, I looked up and saw the road. It didn't register at first. My brain was so fogged over I thought I was imagining it. But then I felt my knees buckle, my body finally giving in, and I hit the ground. I don't remember much after that. Just the feeling of rough dirt under my hands, the sound of my own breathing, and the weight of everything crashing down on me. I must have cried, but I don't remember making the decision to. It just happened. A release of everything I'd been holding in, the fear, the exhaustion, the sheer effort of every single step. But we were out. I don't think I've ever been so tired in my life. Even after I got home, after I got cleaned up and ate real food, my body still felt heavy, like it hadn't caught up to the fact that the ordeal was over. That hike changed something in me. It taught me what true exhaustion feels like, what the limits of my body and mind really are. It taught me how thin the line is between pushing through and breaking down. I don't know if I would do it again, but I know I would never have been able to live with myself if I had walked away and left him there. And that's what kept me moving. I knew something was off about him the moment I met him at the shelter. He was just too eager, too interested, too focused on me. I was midway through a through hike in New Zealand, covering a long section of the trail alone. I'd stopped at a shelter for the night, one of those simple wooden huts along the track where hikers could sleep if they didn't want to set up a tent. They were communal spaces, always a mix of people, some on full through hikes like me, others just doing a popular stretch for a few days. He was one of the latter. I don't even remember his name. Maybe he never told me. But he latched onto me fast, trying to sit too close, commenting on my scratched up legs, asking too many questions. Where I was headed, when I planned to leave in the morning, if I was hiking alone. I kept my answers vague. When the sun dipped below the trees and the sky darkened, I was already thinking about how I could get away from him. I didn't want to risk sleeping too close, didn't want to give him any reason to think I was interested in talking more. I stayed quiet, stayed on the edges of the group, and when everyone settled in for the night, I made sure my gear was packed and ready for a fast escape at dawn. The next morning, before anyone else stirred, I slid out of the shelter like a ghost. I walked fast, breathing in the cold morning air, feeling better with every step I put between myself and that place. It felt good to be alone again, the only sound my boots crunching against the dirt path, the rustle of wind through the trees. The hours passed. The sun climbed. The trail was empty. And then I heard him. At first, it was just a feeling, a vibration in the ground, a change in the air. Something just off enough that my instincts kicked in before my brain caught up. Then I heard the footsteps. Fast. Close. I turned, and there he was. He wasn't just hiking. He had been running. He slowed the moment I saw him, trying to play it off, trying to act like this wasn't strange at all. He waved. I forced myself to wave back. My heart was already pounding. He stayed behind me for a while, walking at a distance, but I could feel his eyes on me. Then he picked up speed, moving up until he was beside me, making small talk. I barely heard what he said. My mind was already racing, running through options. Then he passed me. I thought maybe that would be it. Maybe he'd keep going. Maybe I was being paranoid. But no, he didn't leave. Instead, he slowed just ahead of me, keeping a distance of about 50 meters. He kept looking back, again and again. Every time I thought he was gone, I'd see him stopped ahead, waiting, forcing me to pass. Then he'd fall in behind me, too close, close enough that I could hear his breathing, his footsteps matching mine. This went on for too long. I tried to ignore it. I tried to keep walking, but every nerve in my body was screaming that something was wrong. Finally, I made a decision. I told him I needed to stop, that I had to pee. He hesitated for a second, then walked on ahead. I let him get out of sight, and then I got the hell off the trail. I cut straight into the trees, moving as fast and as quietly as I could. The bush was thick, branches clawing at my arms and legs, damp leaves pressing into my skin. I crouched low, trying to steady my breathing, heart hammering so hard I swore he'd hear it. Then I saw him. He had come back. He wasn't walking ahead like a normal hiker. He was searching. Slow, careful steps. Head turning. Looking for me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. He kept going, further and further back down the trail, scanning the trees, checking the path. I stayed frozen, waiting, watching. When he finally disappeared from view, I moved. I didn't go back to the trail right away. I stayed hidden, cutting through the dense forest, pushing through ferns and tangled undergrowth, keeping parallel to the path without stepping onto it. I moved fast, almost running, my pack bouncing against my back. Only when I was sure the trail was empty did I slip back onto it. Then I ran. Not a full sprint. I couldn't keep that pace with my gear, but as fast as I could manage. Power walking. Jogging when the terrain allowed. I didn't look back. I skipped the next shelter. I pushed on for hours, longer than I ever had before in a single day, muscles screaming, lungs burning. I wanted as much distance as possible. I wanted to disappear. When I finally stopped, setting up camp far off the trail, I felt sick with exhaustion. My body ached. My mind replayed every moment, every mistake. Maybe he had just been lonely. Maybe he had no bad intentions. Maybe I had imagined the worst. But I wasn't going to wait and find out. I didn't sign the logbook at the next shelter. I told a few hikers heading the other way to pass a message to my friends if they saw them, but to say nothing if the man asked about me. I never saw him again. I don't know if he kept going or turned back. I don't know if he was ever really dangerous. But I do know one thing. I've never ignored my gut feeling since that day. Climbing a 13er in Colorado had been on my list for a while. It wasn't one of the big peaks that everyone talked about, but it was a solid challenge. High elevation, some scrambling, long enough to feel like an accomplishment without being outright dangerous. I had planned it for weeks, checking the weather, making sure my gear was right, downloading maps just in case, and getting an early start. Everything had gone smoothly. The ascent was tough but manageable. The air was thin, my legs burned on the steeper sections, and the last bit of scrambling near the summit forced me to take my time. But the view from the top made it worth every step. The landscape stretched in every direction, layers of jagged peaks fading into the horizon, valleys carved deep below, snow still clinging to some of the higher ridges despite the summer heat. The wind was strong up there, whipping across the rocks, reminding me just how exposed the summit really was. I didn't stay long. Clouds were forming in the distance, and I knew how quickly weather could turn in the mountains. Getting caught above the tree line in a storm wasn't an option, so I started down, careful with my footing as I moved back over the loose rock and boulders. The first part of the descent was straightforward, following the same route I had come up. I was focused on my footing, scanning ahead for the best path, moving at a steady but cautious pace. And then, at some point, I went the wrong way. I didn't notice at first. It wasn't like I had turned off the trail at a sharp angle or made some obvious mistake. I was just following what looked like a natural path down, my attention locked on my feet and the next few steps ahead. The terrain was rough, a mix of boulders and dirt, patches of loose scree shifting under my boots. Nothing seemed wrong. It felt like the right way. It wasn't. I don't know how long I kept going before something in my brain finally registered that something was off. Maybe a quarter mile. Maybe more. All I know is that I stopped moving for a second, caught my breath, and looked around, really looked around, and my stomach dropped. The slope ahead of me was steep. Steeper than I remembered. Too steep. The trail wasn't supposed to be like this. I turned my head, scanning the landscape, looking for something familiar. Cairns, the shape of the ridge, anything that matched what I had seen on the way up. Nothing. No trail in sight. No other hikers. Just a vast stretch of rock and steep terrain dropping further below me. And then I looked back up. I immediately wished I hadn't. The way back up to the peak, the way I had just come, looked impossibly steep, like a sheer wall of rock. My brain struggled to accept that I had just scrambled down that without realizing how wrong it was. My legs suddenly felt weak, my breath uneven. I had to sit down, hands gripping the rock beneath me. Panic was setting in fast. For a moment, my mind spiraled into every worst-case scenario at once. I'm lost. I'm stuck. If I go down, I could cliff out. If I go up, I might not make it. If I slip here, I'm done. I forced myself to breathe, steadying the shaking in my hands. I wasn't lost, not completely. I had a map. I had my phone. I just had to think. With my hands still shaking, I pulled my phone out and checked the GPS. My blue dot sat on a blank part of the map, off trail, nowhere near where I was supposed to be. The actual route was above me, to my left. Not ridiculously far, but far enough that I couldn't just cut straight across. The terrain between me and the trail was rough, uneven, full of drop-offs and loose rock. Getting back wasn't going to be easy, but at least I knew where I was. I swallowed hard and made a plan. I couldn't go down any further. That much was clear. The safest bet was to backtrack, climb carefully back up, and angle toward where the trail should be. It wasn't going to be fun, and it wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only choice. I stood up slowly, legs still shaky, forcing myself to focus on one move at a time. Climbing back up was harder than coming down had been. Every step felt unstable, the loose rock shifting under my boots, the steepness making me second-guess every foothold. I had to use my hands, gripping the rough granite, keeping my weight balanced. About halfway up, I made the mistake of looking down. A wave of vertigo hit me hard. The drop below was worse than I had realized, the slope falling away in a mess of loose rock and jagged outcroppings. If I slipped, there was no stopping. My stomach twisted, and I forced my eyes back up. Don't think about falling. Just move. I kept going, heart pounding, breath coming in short bursts. I didn't let myself stop. I didn't let myself think. Just one step, then another. And then finally, I spotted it, a cairn, stacked neatly on a flat section of rock just above me. The trail. Relief crashed over me so hard I almost laughed. I scrambled the last few feet up, pulling myself back onto the proper path, my legs shaking so bad I had to sit down. I could feel my pulse hammering in my skull, my body tense from the sheer amount of adrenaline still coursing through me. I sat there for a while, just breathing, letting myself come down from the fear. Eventually, I stood, shaking out my legs, and started moving again, slowly, carefully, triple-checking my route this time. I kept my eyes up, scanning ahead every few minutes, making sure I was exactly where I needed to be. The rest of the descent was steady, cautious. My body ached, my nerves were shot, but I was back on track. When I finally reached the base of the mountain, stepping onto level ground, I felt like I had just survived something I shouldn't have. Because for a few minutes up there, I really thought I was in serious trouble. That hike changed the way I moved through the mountains. I had always been careful, but now I stopped more often. Now I checked my surroundings more. Now I made damn sure I knew where I was before blindly trusting that the path ahead was the right one. Because getting lost on the descent didn't feel like some harmless mistake. It felt like a warning. Hiking alone had never bothered me. I had been doing it for years, mostly sticking to well-worn trails, but sometimes venturing out onto the lesser-traveled paths when I wanted more solitude. That day, I had driven about 4 hours from home to a trail in Virginia, one I had read about but never hiked before. It wasn't particularly remote, but it also wasn't a place where I expected to run into a lot of people. That was part of the appeal, just me, the woods, and the steady rhythm of my boots on the dirt. I had started late in the morning, the air crisp and cool, the scent of damp earth and pine thick around me. The trail wound through dense forest, dipping in and out of valleys, occasionally opening up to rocky outcrops where I could look out over the trees stretching endlessly into the distance. The silence was absolute. No voices, no distant sounds of traffic. Just birds, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the underbrush, and the crunch of my own footsteps. I hadn't seen another person since I left the parking area. There had been a couple of cars parked at the trailhead, but whoever they belonged to, they were nowhere in sight. That was normal. Some people started early. Some camped overnight. Some took side trails that split off from the main path. It wasn't unusual to go for hours without seeing anyone, especially on a weekday. I was about halfway through my planned route when I came to a water crossing. It was a shallow creek, maybe 10 feet wide, tumbling over smooth, moss-covered rocks. There was no bridge, just a series of large stones placed strategically enough to hop across. I stopped for a moment, stretching my legs, listening to the rush of the water. That was when I noticed the tracks. Fresh boot prints. The mud on the rocks was still wet, smudged slightly where someone had stepped carefully across. They weren't old, not washed out by the water or dried in the sun. Whoever had made them hadn't been far ahead of me. Something about that sent a small prickle up my spine. Not because seeing tracks on a trail was unusual, but because I hadn't seen or heard a single person all day. No distant voices, no movement through the trees, nothing. It was like whoever made those tracks had appeared out of nowhere. I shifted my pack on my shoulders and pulled out my knife. It wasn't much, just a small, fixed blade I always carried for practical reasons, but I felt better having it in my pocket, easier to grab if I needed it. It wasn't fear, exactly. Just a quiet awareness. A shift in my mindset. The way you instinctively become more alert when something doesn't feel quite right. I stepped carefully across the rocks, my boots pressing into the same wet prints left by whoever had been ahead of me. The forest on the other side was thick, the trail winding up into the trees, swallowed quickly by the shadows. I moved on, keeping my pace steady, my ears sharp. 15 minutes later, I saw them. 2 men, coming down the trail toward me. They weren't old, maybe in their late 30s, both dressed in typical hiking gear, jackets, backpacks, boots caked with dried mud. Their faces were serious, expressions tight. One of them lifted a hand in a small wave as they approached, and though they meant no harm, I felt a wave of unease at the interaction. They stopped in front of me. I stopped too. One of them gestured back the way they had come. The other shifted his pack, glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting someone to come walking out of the trees behind them. Then they left. I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding a little harder than it should have been. A man with a machete. That was the kind of warning you took seriously. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees, listening. The silence was suddenly too thick. It felt heavy in a way that made my skin crawl, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I wasn't far from where I had planned to take a break, maybe another 20 minutes up the trail. I debated turning around, but that meant heading back toward whatever, or whoever, had made those guys nervous enough to warn me in the first place. I kept going, slower this time, more careful. Every footstep felt too loud. Every gust of wind through the trees made me flinch. I kept my knife in my pocket, fingers resting on the handle. I never saw him, never heard anything, but the longer I stayed out there, the worse the feeling got. Like eyes on the back of my neck, like something just beyond my vision waiting. The further I went, the harder it became to convince myself it was all in my head. I reached my stopping point, a small clearing near a bend in the trail, a fallen log where I had planned to sit and eat before heading back. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't want to be out there anymore. I turned around, retracing my steps, walking faster now. My muscles were tense, my body coiled like a spring. Every so often, I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to see movement in the trees. Nothing, but that feeling never left. I crossed the creek again, barely stopping to check my footing. Kept going. Miles passed under my boots. The woods were too quiet. The light had shifted, the sun sinking lower, stretching long shadows across the ground. I kept my pace steady, but my breath felt too loud in the silence. When I finally saw the parking area through the trees, relief hit me like a wave. The lot was still mostly empty. My car sat where I had left it. No other people. No sign of the 2 men. No sign of anyone at all. I unlocked my car, threw my pack inside, and got in. I sat there for a long moment, doors locked, hands gripping the steering wheel. The forest loomed in the rearview mirror, dark and endless. I never saw the man with the machete, but someone had. Early season hiking in the Sierra Nevada always came with a mix of excitement and caution. The landscape was still shaking off winter's grip, patches of snow lingering in the shadows, creeks swollen with runoff, and trails barely visible beneath the debris left behind by storms. It was the kind of trip that tested your endurance, your patience, and sometimes your instincts. It was late afternoon when my friend and I reached the basin we had planned to camp in. It was one of those places that felt untouched. Just miles of exposed granite, scattered clusters of pine trees, and small alpine lakes that reflected the sky like glass. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of melting snow and damp earth. We had gone off-trail a few miles back, following the terrain instead of any marked path. It was easier that way, moving freely across the open rock without worrying about switchbacks or trail erosion. It also meant we hadn't seen another person for hours. That was the whole point of coming out here. Quiet, isolation, nothing but the raw wilderness around us. But then we saw him. At first, it wasn't clear if he was actually following us. He was just there, a lone figure, moving in the same direction, far enough away that we couldn't make out details, but close enough that his presence felt intentional. He wasn't with anyone. No pack on his back, no clear direction, just walking. At first, we chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe another backpacker taking a similar route. Maybe he had a camp nearby and was just stretching his legs. It wasn't unusual to see solo hikers out here. Some people liked the solitude, but he never got closer. Never fell too far behind, either. Just stayed at that same uncomfortable distance. We kept hiking, not saying much, but both of us knew something felt off. The light was starting to shift, the golden glow of late afternoon stretching our shadows across the granite. We needed to find a spot to camp before it got too dark. We pushed a little farther, scanning for a good site. Somewhere with a bit of cover, near water, but not too exposed. Eventually, we found a flat stretch of rock near a small meltwater stream. A few stunted pines stood nearby, enough to give some shelter from the wind, but not enough to block the open view of the basin. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. As we dropped our packs, I glanced back the way we had come. He was still there. Only now he wasn't walking. He had stopped, standing at the edge of the open rock, just watching us. My skin went cold. I turned back to my friend, who had already seen him too. We didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. The tension was thick in the air, unspoken but mutual. We set up camp like normal, pulled out our gear, unrolled our sleeping bags, got some food ready. Every move felt too slow, too exposed, like we were performing under a spotlight. I kept my ears sharp, listening for movement, for footsteps, for anything that meant he was getting closer. But he didn't move. He just stood there. Minutes stretched into an hour. The sun dipped lower, washing the granite in a deep orange glow. We kept waiting for him to do something. Leave. Keep walking. Call out. Nothing. The wind picked up, rattling through the trees. The cold started settling in, creeping up from the rock beneath us. We ate in silence, forcing down bites of food that suddenly tasted like nothing. By the time the last light faded from the sky, we had made our decision. We weren't staying. It didn't matter that our gear was already set up. It didn't matter that we were tired. Every part of me, every deep, instinctual part that had kept humans alive for thousands of years, was screaming that this wasn't safe. We waited until the sky was fully dark. Then we moved. Slowly, carefully, packing up our gear without making a sound. Every zipper, every rustle of fabric, every step on the granite felt impossibly loud. The darkness made it worse. Our vision was limited, forcing us to rely on touch and memory as we gathered our things. We didn't bother with flashlights. The moon was bright enough, casting a pale glow over the open rock. Good enough to see by, bad enough that we felt exposed every time we moved. I kept glancing back to where he had been. Nothing. The spot was empty. That didn't mean he was gone. We finished packing and didn't waste another second. Without a word, we started moving. Away from the basin, away from the water, away from wherever he might be waiting. We stuck to the granite, avoiding tree cover, keeping to the open rock where we could see in every direction. The silence felt heavy. Every gust of wind made my shoulders tense. Every distant crack of shifting ice or falling rock sent a spike of adrenaline through my veins. My body was running on instinct now, legs moving faster than they should, breath shallow, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. Nothing. We kept going, over ridges, across patches of snow, down into valleys. We didn't stop, didn't rest. Just kept moving, one foot after the other, fueled by that deep, gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach. Eventually, after what felt like hours, we found another spot. Far from where we had been, hidden in the folds of the terrain. No water nearby, no clear trail, just a patch of rock barely big enough for us to set up again. This time, we didn't wait. We got our sleeping bags out, laid down, and forced ourselves to rest. The night passed slowly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there again, watching, waiting, but he never came. Morning arrived, pale and cold. We packed up again, still on edge but relieved to see the empty landscape around us. No footprints, no signs of movement, just the Sierra stretching endlessly in every direction. We never saw him again, never heard anything, never found a trace. Maybe he left. Maybe he kept going, minding his own business, never realizing what kind of fear he had put into us. Or maybe he had been waiting for us to fall asleep. Springtime in the mountains was always unpredictable. One moment, the sun would be shining through the trees, warming the earth and making the river sparkle like glass. The next, clouds would roll in, dropping the temperature just enough to remind you that winter hadn't fully let go yet. That was the kind of weather we had when my friend and I went on a 2-day hiking trip along a river trail in the spring of 2022. The plan was simple, 4 miles in total, but we'd only do half the first day, camp at the halfway point, and finish the hike the next morning. The first 2 miles weren't too bad. The trail followed the river, weaving through dense patches of trees, overgrown brush, and stretches of jagged rocks. We had to cross the river multiple times, which was a pain because the water was still freezing from snowmelt. Even with waterproof boots, my feet were constantly cold. Every step made a sloshing sound, like my socks were permanently soaked. By late afternoon, we found a decent camping spot off the trail, a little clearing nestled between the trees with enough space to set up without being completely exposed. The river was close enough that we could hear it, but far enough that it wouldn't be a problem if the water rose overnight. We hung our hammocks between the trees, got a small fire going, and settled in for the night. It was quiet. Too quiet. You don't really notice how much noise there is in everyday life until you're out in the woods, away from everything. The silence pressed in from all sides. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant rush of the river, and the crackling of the fire. As the night went on, the temperature dropped fast. I wrapped myself tighter in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the ache in my muscles from the hike. It wasn't long before I dozed off, listening to the distant howl of wind moving through the trees. I woke up early. The sun wasn't fully up yet, but there was enough light to see through the thin fabric of my hammock. My body was stiff from sleeping in the same position all night. My fingers were cold. I stretched my legs, listening to the sound of birds waking up in the trees above me. Then something felt off. It took me a second to realize what it was. There was movement just outside my hammock. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head and peeked through the gap in my hammock's fabric. My breath caught in my throat. 2 kids stood on the trail. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7, and a younger boy, no older than 4 or 5. They were soaked. Their clothes clung to their small frames, heavy with water. Their hair dripped onto their faces. Their shoes, if they had been wearing any at all, were caked in mud. Their hands were pale, their fingers curled into small fists at their sides. They were shivering. I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no one else around. No adults. No signs of another campsite. Just these 2 kids standing there, looking completely out of place. The girl lifted a small, shaking hand and waved. I hesitated before lifting my own and waving back. My brain was still trying to catch up to the situation. Where were their parents? How did they get here? The trail wasn't easy. It had multiple river crossings, thick underbrush, and steep inclines. Even fully grown adults struggled with some parts of it. The girl opened her mouth and said something, but I didn't process it at first. My ears were still adjusting from sleep, my mind still sluggish. But then the words sank in. They were lost. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I sat up fully in my hammock, ignoring the stiffness in my back. My friend was stirring, probably waking up from the movement. I turned to look at the kids again. They hadn't moved. The girl was staring at me with wide eyes, waiting for something, an answer, a reaction, anything. I climbed out of my hammock as quickly as I could, my boots crunching against the dirt. The air was colder than I expected. I could see the kids shivering harder now that I was paying attention. Their faces were red from the cold, their lips slightly blue. My friend was sitting up now, looking just as confused as I felt. We didn't waste time. Packing up took longer than I wanted it to. My hands felt slow, clumsy. The whole time, my brain was running through every possible worst-case scenario. Had they been out here all night? Were their parents nearby, frantically searching? Or were they back at their campsite, unaware that their kids had wandered off? The trail wasn't safe. The river crossings alone were enough to make my stomach turn. The water was deep in some areas, the currents stronger than they looked. If these kids had crossed them by themselves, I pushed the thought away. No point in panicking. Once we had our gear packed, we started walking back the way the kids had come. The little girl held her brother's hand tightly, leading him forward as best she could. Every now and then, she'd glance back at us, as if making sure we were still there. The hike back was tense. The river crossings were worse than I remembered. The water was moving faster in the morning, carrying debris from farther upstream. We had to take it slow, guiding the kids across carefully. The boy stumbled more than once, his little legs barely strong enough to fight the current. Every time, his sister yanked him back up, gripping his hand so tight her knuckles turned white. Time moved strangely. The hike back felt twice as long as it had the day before. My mind kept racing through everything that could have gone wrong. If we hadn't been there, if they had kept wandering in the wrong direction, if they had slipped into the river, if the temperature had dropped any lower overnight. We eventually found their campsite. It was farther than I expected, at least a mile from where we had found them. A small clearing near the riverbank, with a tent and a smoldering fire. The moment we stepped into view, a woman came running. She looked frantic. Her hair was a mess, her clothes wrinkled like she hadn't slept at all. Behind her, a man was getting up from a camping chair, his face pale and tense. The second the woman reached the kids, she dropped to her knees, pulling them into a tight hug. I could hear her breathing fast, her voice shaky as she checked them over. The man stood beside her, his hands on his hips, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. We didn't stick around. There wasn't much to say. They had their kids back. That was all that mattered. As we turned to leave, I glanced back one last time. The little girl was still looking at me. This time, she didn't wave. Basic training was hell. No way around it. The heat, the exhaustion, the endless screaming from drill sergeants. It all blurred together into one long, miserable stretch of time. Every day felt like it lasted a week. But that 12-mile ruck? That was something else entirely. Mid-August in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, meant temperatures that made the air feel like it was pressing down on you. No breeze, no relief. The sun just hung there, glaring, making the sweat pour out of you faster than you could drink water. Every breath felt thick. You'd think after 6 weeks of this I'd be used to it, but I wasn't. No one was. We just finished the ruck. My legs were trembling. My shoulders felt like they were about to snap in half from the weight of the pack. Everything was sore. Muscles I didn't even know I had were on fire. When we finally stopped to rest, I dropped onto some rocks near a tree with low-hanging branches. It wasn't comfortable, but nothing really was at that point. Most of us were too exhausted to talk, but the few that did were bitching about the heat. I just sat there, staring at the dirt, trying to ignore the way my head pounded. Then I felt it. Something against my back. A slow, sliding sensation, just below my shoulder blades. My first thought was sweat. It made sense. I was drenched, my uniform was sticking to my skin, and it wasn't uncommon to feel a trickle running down my back. I just shifted my shoulders a bit, trying to shake it off. But the feeling didn't go away. It moved lower. Another slow, deliberate glide against my spine. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to reach back and touch whatever it was. I had this irrational thought that if I ignored it, maybe it would just stop. Then, a voice, sharp as a knife, cut through the air. "Don't you fucking move a muscle." The way my drill sergeant said it made my entire body go cold. I didn't even look at him. I just stared straight ahead. Every nerve in me locked up. Then chaos. The soldiers around me scrambled back, so fast I heard rocks tumbling down the hillside. Boots stomped against the dirt. Someone swore under their breath. And then I felt it. A shift. A weight. Something alive was under my uniform. I think my brain rejected the most obvious answer. It couldn't be a snake. It had to be something else. A mouse, maybe? A big bug. Anything but a snake. The drill sergeant was moving toward me, slow and careful, like he was sneaking up on something dangerous. I could feel every muscle in my body screaming at me to move, to do something, but I didn't. I couldn't. Then it happened. A sudden burst of movement. My shirt jerked. The thing inside it was shifting fast. I felt the weight slide lower, curling slightly. Then pressure, firm but deliberate, against my ribs. I wanted to scream, but I locked my jaw. Then violence. A sudden tussle against my back. It was over in seconds, but it felt like forever. I was shoved forward, nearly face-planting onto the rocks. Behind me, a flurry of motion, shouting, movement, something snapping. The drill sergeant had the thing in his hands, and he was swinging it. The first impact was a sickening crack against the rocks. The second, harder. The third, a loud, wet thud. And then it was over. I turned just in time to see the limp body of a snake, jet black, thick-bodied, slump onto the ground. The drill sergeant didn't even hesitate. He lifted his boot and stomped down hard. The sound made me want to throw up. It was a cottonmouth. A big one. I barely even realized I was breathing hard until I tasted bile in the back of my throat. I turned away and retched, my whole body shaking. The drill sergeant just looked at me, unimpressed. I didn't say anything. No one did. For a long time, we just stood there in silence, staring at the dead snake. Then, wordlessly, everyone went back to their spots, like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake it. I felt it, the weight of it, the slow, deliberate slide of its body against my skin, the way it moved, coiling lower and lower. like it had every intention of striking if I so much as breathed wrong. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down, but I couldn't. Even that night, long after we'd moved on, I could still feel it. The ghost of that sensation, slithering against my back.